want to thank everyone for coming, despite this dire weather prediction. But I think the sanctuary stayed pretty cool. Our sexton did a fabulous job of keeping things cool, and we have the fans. So I just appreciate so much that you all bothered to come out. The adult education and social justice teams of First Church are honored to present this program with the Longmeadow Historical Society. First Church is a United Church of Christ church. We are an open and affirming church who welcomes everyone and are committed to the values taught by Jesus, loving our neighbors and social justice for all. In many ways, the history of First Church is the early history of Longmeadow. The church served as the meeting house for the community. It has had a proud history of over 300 years. 2 years ago, our former pastor, Pam McGrath, gave a powerful sermon about our church's pre-Revolutionary War history. The diaries of our first pastor, Stephen Williams, revealed his own ownership of enslaved people and the connection of 16 enslaved people with our early church. It was not uncommon for pastors of that time to own slaves. Last fall, the church sponsored an educational program sponsored by the Jewish community of Amherst that addressed the issue of reparations to African Americans for the injustices of slavery. We learned painful history, and that was the first step of reparations is to acknowledge our history. This program is in no way meant to diminish or tarnish this church's history or the 60-plus year pastorate of Stephen Williams. It is our belief that understanding and owning our history, our complete history, with its progress and pain, helps us be more authentic as a gathered community. By saying the names of these 16 Longmeadow residents who have never before been publicly acknowledged, we hope to honor them and give them a proper place at our table. I wish to introduce Melissa Sabalski, a board member of the Longmeadow Historical Society and a local historian who we are so fortunate to have work with us. She wrote and organized this program. Hear their names, know their story, honor their memory.
Thank you, Helene, and First Church Adult Education and Social Justice teams for inviting us here today. I do think we should take a moment to perhaps, if you have your cell phones on, turn them off. This is a good moment to do that. My colleagues, Beth Hoff, Betsy McKee, Al McKee, and I from the Longmeadow Historical Society are grateful for the opportunity to share the stories you will hear today in the very space where this history happened. Look around you. This building has been sitting on the Longmeadow Town Green since 1767. Before that, there was another building just like it right next door. Nearly every name you will hear today stood in this very building. In the 1700s, this was the meeting house, a catch-all term for all of the functions the building was used for. Meeting for worship, meeting for town and school planning, meeting to muster the military, meeting to share news. Before there was the bell in the belfry, there was a drummer who would walk up and down the street alerting people to gather. The rooster weather vane on top of the steeple has been there for centuries. The burying yard behind this building has been the scene of sad funerals since 1719 and continues to be so today. The Red House, 2 doors down, was a tavern, and so many of the houses surrounding the green, the ones with the red stars, were here and filled with families like yours, working, playing, and doing their best to live a purposeful life. Today, right across the crosswalk, stands the community house. Then it was the parsonage, home to the first minister of First Church, Reverend Stephen Williams, who documented nearly every day of his ministry in a diary. That diary has been the foundation for much of our work, along with church and town records, wills and probates and newspaper databases. We have all become quite adept at making our way through 18th century handwriting. You will see some of it today in the slides where I have pulled the name for each person directly from William's diary in his own handwriting or other records. It will perhaps give you a sense of the immense challenges we have been up against. For generations, Reverend Stephen Williams was celebrated for his fascinating turn as the boy captive of Old Deerfield. That story is still very true and still very fascinating. Yes, when he was 10, he and his family were among 112 Deerfield men, women, and children who were captured and taken on a 300-mile forced march to Canada in harsh winter conditions after a raid led by French Canadians and their Indigenous allies. But he grew up, and he lived a whole life beyond that. Reverend Stephen Williams devoted his entire pastorate life to this town and this church. He was minister for 66 years, dying in 1782 in the waning months of the American Revolution. He was 89 years old. He was an important, stabilizing figure in Longmeadow's formative years. And Reverend Williams was an enslaver, owning at least a dozen Africans or African Americans. They were a part of his life and his household right next door. He was not the only enslaver in Longmeadow, and definitely not the only minister who enslaved people in the Connecticut River Valley. Because of the labor provided by these people, Reverend Williams and his family were able to focus on establishing a more prosperous quality of life for themselves. And it is important to understand that slave labor in the South and the Sugar Islands of the West Indies was critical for the New England economy. Ultimately, most people living in Longmeadow in the 17th through 19th centuries were benefiting in some form from slave labor. As we gather here to say their names, many for the first time, I truly can feel their presence. Pulling together these narratives over the past month or so from the pages and pages and pages of research notes we have compiled over the past few years has been an inspired process for me. Before I was a Longmeadow historian, I was an English teacher. And I have often turned to poetry to look for the pretty way of capturing profound meaning. I found it in these lines from Phyllis Wheatley, herself an enslaved girl in 18th century Massachusetts. In the poem to a young African painter on seeing his works, she wrote, "But when these shades of time are chased away, and darkness ends in everlasting day, on what seraphic pinions shall we move and view the landscapes in the realms above? There shall thy tongue in heavenly murmurs flow, and there my muse with heavenly transport glow." These 16 voices have been my seraphic muses throughout this process. Today you will hear their names and what we know about their stories. And please know there are more than 16 people who lived a life of slavery in Longmeadow. Today is just a start. Today, you will hear about those we know who were either owned by the First Church minister and or present in First Church records. I ask you to take a moment, turn around, notice the southwest gallery balcony. That was the Negro Gallery, where Stan's equipment is. That was the Negro Gallery. That is where they sat. And today I feel their spirit with us. Let us tell you about them. Nicholas. The first person known to be enslaved by Reverend Stephen Williams was a child named Nicholas. Williams was 23 years old, and in the first year of his ministry when he took possession of the boy. We don't know where Nicholas came from or who his parents were or how he came to be separated from them. Though it is impossible to know exactly how old Nicholas was at the time, Williams' language indicates that he was young by referring to him as, quote, "my lad that I have bought," quote, "my poor boy," quote, "my little boy." What I do know is that Nicholas was unhappy, perhaps even miserable, which is only natural considering he was just a child. Of the approximately 11 times Reverend Williams mentions him in his diary, most are to comment about Nicholas being disobedient or deceitful. In February, Williams wrote, quote, "This day I had somewhat of the ill carriage of my boy Nicholas, and so was forced to correct him in the evening. Yet he seems to be penitent and promises reformation. I hope he will reform. I pray God to direct me to do my duty with respect to the lad." For good or bad, Nicholas gained a mistress when Williams married Abigail Davenport in July. Like her husband, the minister's new wife grew up in a home where enslaved people were part of the household landscape. What did her presence mean in young Nicholas's life? Judging by the diary, a month into the marriage, it was not a happy household. August 1st, 1718, quote, "I had the occasion this day to correct my boy for his disobedience. I am concerned about him. What shall I do with him? He is so unlucky and unfaithful." August 2nd, quote, "This day more complaints come in against my boy. I don't know what to do with him." August 8th, 1718, quote, "This day my boy Nicholas came home from work and said he was not well. I was somewhat thoughtful he was only lazy, but I perceived afterward that he was much amiss, had a considerable fever." Nicholas spent much of the month of August suffering from a lingering feverish illness. Within 2 months, Nicholas was sold away, likely to someone up in Deerfield. How did Nicholas feel about leaving the Williams household? We actually have some insight through Williams' own words when he wrote, quote, "He seemed to be very concerned that he was sold about, and truly I seemed to be grieved for him, but yet I thought it would be for his benefit to be sold to a master that would keep him to business, as well as for my profit. Unfortunately, after being sold away, we lose track of the young boy." Nicholas, today in front of this congregation, we say your name. We see you and we honor you. James. 5 months later, Williams tried again. He bought James, writing, quote, March 26, 1719, "This day I bought me a servant man. Some of my neighbors think it may be for the better. Others think not. I pray to help me do my duty towards him." We don't know what James looked like, how old he was, or where he came from. What we do know about James, however, is a detail we don't have for any other enslaved person owned by Reverend Williams. We know how much James cost. In a household accounting record, Williams recorded, quote, "to paying for my man James 10 pounds. To give you a sense of how much 10 pounds could buy you in 1719, elsewhere, Williams records paying between 3 pounds and 4 pounds for cows and 10 pounds for a horse. James cost as much as a horse. Williams' salary during his first year in ministry was 55 pounds. The only other mentions of James deal with his transgressions, for which he was, quote, "corrected," and once for, quote, "being out of frame," once for, quote, "being out last night unseasonably." And what of James staying out too late one night? What might he have been up to? This is a good opportunity to talk about the black population in Longmeadow in general in 1719. There were a few other households in Longmeadow with enslaved people, and it is quite likely that free blacks made up part of the workforce in town as well. In the years after James came and went, it seems that Reverend Williams himself hired a free black man named Robin, who lived in his house and worked his land. Robin exercised his freedom to negotiate better pay and his freedom to leave of his own free will. For James, however, he was bought and owned. His time was not his own, and there was no salary to negotiate. It is easy to imagine both free and enslaved blacks sharing time and space and companionship together in off hours. They certainly shared space together on the Sabbath day, here in church, up in that southwest corner of the balcony. James appears in the diary 3 times between March and July 1719, and then he disappears from the record. James, today in front of this congregation, we say your name. We see you and we honor you. Phyllis. Phyllis, without a doubt, spent the longest time as an enslaved person in the household of Reverend Williams. For nearly 50 years, she lived and worked under his roof in the parsonage, again, right next door. She arrived as a girl, bore at least one child, lost at least one child, and married a man enslaved in another household in town. Phyllis first appeared in February 1728 when Williams and his wife were in their 30s and parents to 4 young children, though during the course of Phyllis's life, the minister and his wife would welcome 4 more. It's unknown how old Phyllis was when she arrived, but in those first years, Williams refers to her as, quote, our Negro girl. Perhaps it is Phyllis who is the, quote, Negro wench, who bore a child out of wedlock 2 years later, causing the minister to worry that there has, quote, been sin and trouble. You will hear more about that child shortly. 8 years after this birth, Phyllis perplexed Reverend and Mrs. Williams by expressing her desire to marry an enslaved man in town named Peter, who was owned by Captain Colton. More than a year later, Williams was still anxiously pondering the matter and says that the town was, quote, uneasy over the situation, and his wife was, quote, averse to it. Church records indicate that Phyllis and Peter did ultimately get their wish to marry, but not until 6 years and many pleas had passed. They were never able to establish a household together as husband and wife. Phyllis was baptized at First Church, made a public profession, and was admitted into communion at First Church, married at First Church, and in death was buried out of First Church. As a female servant in the Williams household, she likely contributed to tasks within the female sphere: cooking, washing, doctoring, cleaning, mending. In 1771, an aging Stephen Williams drafted his last will and testament in which he left Phyllis to his sons, John and Samuel. She did not outlive her enslaver, though. On May 28, 1774, as talk of revolution was reaching a fever pitch all through the colonies, Phyllis died of, quote, an apoplectic fit. Williams, 80 years old himself, wrote in his diary, quote, death is come into our house. Phyllis had the character of being honest, and I hope she had sight of Christ by faith. The Lord be pleased to pardon my defects of duty towards her and to my other servants deceased. But her death does not appear in the church records. He mentioned a considerable number of people attended her funeral the next day. However, there is no headstone in the cemetery marking Phyllis's nor any other enslaved person's final resting place. They are likely buried there today, along with countless other unmarked graves of Longmeadow residents whose situations, whether financial or social, prevented them from receiving permanent markers. Phyllis, today, in front of this congregation, we say your name, we see you, and we honor you. Scipio. Scipio was a child likely born into slavery at the Williams parsonage. I suspect his mother was Phyllis. Throughout multiple diary entries, Williams refers to him as, quote, our black boy and our Negro boy. Only by matching up a baptismal record with the diary entries can we identify the boy by name, Scipio. While definitely not a common name in colonial New England, Scipio is in fact a common name among enslaved black men in colonial New England, derived from Scipio Africanus, the ancient Roman general who triumphed over Hannibal in Africa, which begs the question as to how the name became popular among the enslaved population. Was it chosen by their mothers or by their enslavers, often Harvard and Yale-educated ministers who were schooled in the history of the ancient world? The 1731 baptismal record states, quote, I baptized our Negro boy Scipio, I and my wife, are publicly promising that we would endeavor that he would have a Christian education. That Christian education was a key difference between the colonial New England slavery and Southern slavery in the 19th century. Colonial ministers like Reverend Williams believed in the importance of teaching their enslaved people to read, specifically so that they could better access the Word of God through the Bible, the same book that was used against them as justification for keeping them in bondage. There was a clear closeness, if only physical, between Williams's own children and Scipio. Whenever William's children were sick, Scipio was sick. When Scipio was not quite 3 years old, the minister's sons brought home an illness that nearly killed them. Many other town families had sick children as well. Most recovered, but Scipio did not, and died within days of the onset of symptoms. Reverend Williams wrote on April 8, 1733, quote, "A distressed day with respect to the black boy who has lain as we apprehended in the agonies of death. His groans are affecting and distressing." The next day he wrote, quote, "Last night it pleased God to take away the black boy by death. O Lord, be pleased to teach us all by this providence and support the poor bereaved mother." Scipio, today in front of this congregation, we say your name. We see you and we honor you.
Stamford. Stamford, though sometimes called Stanford, was an enslaved man who first appeared in the Stephen Williams diary in July 1734. It would appear that Williams acquired Stamford unexpectedly from a mysterious S.W. Esquire B., as noted in his diary. Williams fretted that the purchase put him into debt. According to the diary, quote, "S.W. Esquire B. informs me that he has bought me a servant. Thus I run into debt and my care increases," unquote. Stamford's presence brought the total number of people living in the parsonage to at least 11. Phyllis was there, and Reverend and Mrs. Williams, and their 7 children. An eighth child, Nathan, would be added 1 year later. It is during this time that as many as 3 indigenous boys also joined the household. They came from Stockbridge, where Reverend Williams was working to establish a school for Mohican boys so that they could receive a Christian education. We believe that Stamford also would have been taught to read if he didn't already know how. Just like the Mohican Stockbridge boys, as Melissa said, it was important for all enslaved people to be able to read so that they could read the Bible and better come to know the Word of God. Stamford was bought to be a farmhand. Most diary entries mention his work in the fields alongside the minister's sons, as well as the injuries he received or that he narrowly avoided. In 1734, we learned that, quote, "This day Stephen and the Negro man were remarkably preserved when in danger by the overturning of a cart with a plow in it," unquote. And then in 1735, quote, "Last night Stamford was remarkably preserved when he fell from the mow. He is something bruised," unquote. 2 years after Stamford arrived, Williams writes of being troubled about how his oldest son, then 16 years old, was using his power toward Stamford. He wrote, quote, "I hear of the imprudence of my son John in dealing with a Negro. I wish the child better conduct," unquote. This will become a repeated theme in the decades to come. Where John is involved with the male slaves, trouble seems to follow. Stamford disappeared from the diary for 15 years, so long that it seemed likely he was not living in the Williams parsonage anymore. He reappeared just long enough for us to learn how he died. Pleurisy, Reverend Williams called it. His knees and legs became painfully swollen. He suffered for 10 days before dying. On February 1, 1752, Williams wrote of his burial, quote, "This day Stanford is laid in the dark, silent grave, the place where the servant is free from his master," unquote. Stanford, today in front of this congregation, we say your name, we see you, and we honor you. Tobiah. Tobiah is a mystery among mysteries. He appeared only in First Church records and never in Stephen Williams' diary. The church record of August 16, 1747 states, quote, "I baptized one Negro boy, Tobiah, and publicly declared before God and his people that I would endeavor and assist that he should have a Christian education, if God be pleased to spare him," close quote. This language indicates that Williams was assuming responsibility for raising the boy. It is unclear how young Tobiah was, where he came from, or if he was born of an enslaved mother here in Longmeadow. We know nothing more of Tobiah than his name and date of baptism here at First Church. Tobiah, today in front of this congregation, we say your name, we see you, and we honor you. Saunders and Jenny were a married and enslaved couple belonging to Stephen Williams. They first appeared together in a curious diary mention in September 1748 as, quote, "having run away again," unquote. Again is an important word here, and one which makes his entry curious. Prior to this dire entry, there were no other obvious or even subtle references to their existence. The 14-year period when Jenny and Saunders are in the Williams family is an incredibly busy one in Williams' diary. His children are getting older, marrying and establishing their own households. The town is growing. Williams is frequently called on to act as a respected leader in the greater Congregationalist world. And the Massachusetts Bay Colony is mired down in King George's War and the 7 Years' War. During Saunders and Jenny's life in Longmeadow, as many as 6 enslaved people shared the labor with them at the parsonage and in the fields belonging to Reverend Williams and his eldest son, John. Reverend Williams was a mature 54 years old when Jenny and Saunders ran away again, and his son, John, was running a farm and had a family of his own in Somers. From the 1740s through the 1770s, their enslaved people frequently traveled between the two households. When they ran away, they never got too far. John was sent in pursuit one time, but they returned on their own a few days later, saying they had only wandered in the woods. The diary states, "Saunders came hither. He and his wife wandered in the woods till the Sabbath. I fear they are great liars," unquote. Saunders tried to run away again in 1752, but was captured and returned. Jenny died in 1761 at John's house after a long fever. Williams wrote, "Jenny died last night. The Lord be pleased to sanctify the providence to Saunders and to all her descendants, and to my son's family, and to all of us that had a concern with her and her descendants," unquote. That word descendants is striking. Did Jenny have descendants? Where were they? Were they taken from her when she and Saunders went to the Williams house? Or were they taken from her while she was there? These are answers we almost certainly will never have. Saunders died 1 year later in 1762. Poor old Saunders, Williams wrote, perhaps the only clue to his age. He died at 3 o'clock in the morning of December 6. Prayers were held for him at John's house, and they attended him to the grave. Like Jenny's descendants, we will never know where his grave is. Jenny and Saunders, today in front of this congregation, we say your names. We see you and we honor you.
Tom was an enslaved person owned by Reverend Stephen Williams, who first appeared in Reverend Williams's diary within 2 years of Stamford's death. He joined Phyllis and Saunders and Jenny, and like them, we don't know where he came from or under what circumstances. The first time Tom was mentioned, he was, quote, violently ill, end quote. The second mention is when Tom apparently, quote, behaved saucily and unbecomingly, that we were forced to tie him up. He appeared penitent, and I forgave him, end quote. The pronoun used there is striking, quote, we were forced to tie him up, end quote. It begs the question, who is the we? Tom is one of only 2 enslaved people for whom we have an age and a physical description. The only reason we have this information is because he ran away, and Reverend Williams placed an ad for reward for his return. The advertisement describes Tom as a, quote, thick fellow, aged about 22 years, in a pair of trousers, a brown waistcoat, and a linen cap, no stockings, no shoes, end quote. Reverend Williams placed the ad in a Connecticut paper. Perhaps he thought Tom was heading for the shore to board a ship, as many runaways of various classes and races were known to do. Tom didn't, though. For many days, Williams writes of his son's search for Tom. He hadn't run far, though. 9 days after disappearing, Tom's body was found in the mill pond off Longmeadow Brook. We have strong reason to believe that this mill pond is today the pond at Longmeadow Country Club. A formal inquest at the time of his death claimed that Tom, quote, then and there voluntarily and feloniously, as a felon of himself, did kill and murder himself by drowning himself in a certain mill pond in the precinct of Longmeadow, end quote. That evening, Williams recorded in his diary, quote, the coroner came and a jury sat upon the corpse of the poor self-destroyer. Oh, what wretched creatures are we, how full of sin, end quote. Tom's only freedom came in his decision to end his own life. Tom, today in front of this congregation, we say your name, we see you, and we honor you. Peter appeared in the tumultuous mid-1750s just before Tom drowns himself, but while Phyllis, Saunders, and Jenny are still enslaved at the Williams household. Like Saunders and Jenny, Peter split his time between the parsonage in Longmeadow and John Williams's farm in Somers. Most diary entries mentioning Peter show him bringing livestock or messages back and forth between houses. He was first referred to as a, quote, boy, end quote, who got lost traveling in from Somers with a yoke of oxen on a stormy night. It is intriguing to think that Peter could have possibly been Phyllis's son with her husband Peter, who was owned by another Longmeadow resident. In 1771, when Reverend Williams drafted his will, he He left Phyllis to his sons to be given what was, quote, proper and needful and comfortable for her as long as she lives. End quote. He then added, quote, in consideration thereof, I do give to my said sons Sam and Samuel my Negro servant Peter, to John and Samuel in equal proportions, that is, one shall have one half, and the other one half of right and interest in him, end quote. Did he think this would be a comfort to Phyllis because Peter was her family? Perhaps he was named for his father. At this point, though, this is simply a theory. After Phyllis died, Peter ran away. It was 1773. Stephen Williams had grown old. John, his son, had grown mean enough to draw worry about his behavior from his father and brothers. John's own son had run away. Then Peter ran. This grieved and angered Reverend Williams, who had gone so far as to consider giving him his liberty at a time when liberty was very much on the minds of many people in the colonies. But he didn't, and Peter ran. Williams took to his diary to write, quote, this day my son John sends me word that Peter Negro is run away ungratefully, left my son, now under difficulty, who has been kind to him and very tender of him. I had been thinking of setting him at liberty if it could be done without injury to me or the public. What measures to take now I am at a loss. Desire I may not do anything that may be dishonorable to religion. John Williams placed an ad for Peter after he ran away, calling him their, quote, Negro servant, stout and well-set fellow, betwixt 30 and 40 years of age, very black. He took a considerable quantity of clothing with him. He can read and write well. It is not unlikely he may have a forged pass. He can play well upon a fiddle and took a good one with him, end quote. An $8 reward was offered for Peter's return. Peter may actually have secured his own freedom. There is no mention of his return, nor is he ever mentioned in the diary again. Peter, today in front of this congregation, we say your name, we see you, and we honor you. Cato, like many of his enslaved brothers and sisters, first appeared in Stephen Williams's diary in a time of illness. Of all the enslaved people that crossed the pages of Reverend Williams's diary, Cato seems the most distressed. In 1759, 1 year after he first appeared, Cato approached Reverend Williams and asked to be sold. He didn't ask for his freedom, he asked to be sold. He wasn't. 1 year later, Cato entered Williams's study asking what was to be done with him after his master died. Quote, this day poor Cato asked what he shall do when I am dead, who he shall live with, end quote. This is a reasonable question considering Reverend Williams was nearing 70 years old in 1760. A year later, Cato appeared again in Williams's study to ask another version of the same question. Williams wrote that day in March 1761, quote, this morning Cato movingly advised me of my mortality by asking what he shall do when I am dead, which he says will be by and by. The Lord help me to realize this and give me repentance and new obedience till my change may come, end quote. It seems Williams worried over his own mortality while Cato worried over his own future. In fact, Cato died a full 2 decades before Reverend Williams. The last few months of his life were a time of emotional crisis for him. At the end of October 1762, Reverend Williams wrote that, quote, we had an uncomfortable night. Poor Cato was in a piteous case, had, I fear, drank too much cider and his mind turmoiled, end quote. The next day, Reverend Williams wrote that Cato had a public outburst. Quote, he went to the public worship but spoke out loud at the end of the afternoon sermon, end quote. Did Cato's outburst come from the Negro gallery above? 2 weeks later, he, quote, stripped himself naked, end quote, and flung a woman down. Williams wrote, quote, by the advice of my neighbors, Cato was whipped very severely, end quote, and appeared, quote, somewhat penitent, end quote. Cato continued to act out over the next few days and was, quote, severely corrected again, end quote, with several neighbors present. After weeks of alternating peace and tumult, Cato was sent to John Williams's farm. He appeared to be improving until 2 weeks later. William's son-in-law, quote, brought us an account that Cato was missing and 'twas supposed was drowned in the well, a most awful and affecting affair. Give us to consider our ways in conduct and behavior toward our servants. Samuel went out and accounted they had drawn Cato out of the well. The Lord be pleased to teach us, guide us, and pardon us, end quote. It's unclear if Williams was looking for a pardon for himself and his actions or for Cato, whose suicide was considered a sin against God. Cato, today in front of this congregation, we say your name, we see you, and we honor you. Joseph. Joseph first appeared in Reverend Williams's diary in 1759 and would have been present for all the hardships surrounding Cato. When Joseph first appeared, it had been more than 40 years since Williams sold young Nicholas away. With the exception of updates on Cato's and Tom's situations, months and sometimes years go between even casual mentions of the people he has purchased to allow his busy household and farm to function so efficiently. Joseph's presence was so commonplace that Williams only wrote of him to say, quote, our Negro Joseph has the measles, but things look favorable, end quote. And from that point on, over the next decade or so, it is difficult to parse out which Joseph Reverend Williams is referring to when he mentions his name, because along with him and Phyllis and Peter and Cato were two white indentured servants brought under contract from a Boston poorhouse a few years earlier, one of whom was also named Joseph Bumstead. And he would often be referred to in the diary as Joseph Bumstead. Joseph, the enslaved man, bore no last name. Joseph, who must have been gone by 1771 when Reverend Williams wrote his will, because he wasn't mentioned among his assets to be left to someone dear to him. Williams writes so frequently and passionately of people's dying that I imagine that was not how he left. Perhaps, like Nicholas, Joseph was sold for Williams's benefit. But it appears that Joseph may have been the last, quote, Negro servant, end quote, to be bought by Williams. By 1771, seemingly only Phyllis and Peter remained to be mentioned in that last will and testament. Joseph, today in front of this congregation, we say your name, we see you, and we honor you.
Reverend Williams was not the only enslaver in the town of Longmeadow in the 18th century. What follows are the names and stories we have been able to piece together for 4 more people known to have been held in bondage and baptized into First Church. They would have sat in the, quote, Negro balcony, closest to the little boys and the large boys. Imagine the experience. The next enslaved person to tell you about is our second man named Peter. He was identified as, quote, Negro servant to Sergeant John Cooley in February 1734 when Reverend Williams writes of baptizing him in his diary. The Cooleys are among the earliest settlers of Longmeadow. Sergeant Cooley is believed to be the one mentioned several times about 15 years earlier in the diary in connection with a stolen delivery of church wine that had been dropped off down by the river. To be more specific, quote, Cooley's Indian was suspected to be responsible for the stolen wine. This simple phrasing, Cooley's Indian, reminds us that blacks were not the only victims of enslavers. Indigenous people were captured, bought, traded, and sold as well. The case of the stolen wine, after many weeks of accusing Cooley's Indian, a white man confessed to the crime. Peter was baptized the same day as Phyllis, but Sergeant Cooley's Peter was not the Peter that Phyllis pleaded to marry. First Church records noted that Peter, among others that day, including Phyllis and one of Sergeant Cooley's own daughters, quote, made a public profession of religion and was, quote, admitted to our fellowship. His last will and testament noted that Sergeant Cooley was a yeoman, an 18th century farmer. He was also a revered and trusted member of this town and this church, serving at various times as a town-appointed moderator, assessor, selectman, and an all-important church-appointed member of the meeting house seating committee. Enslavers were often among the men with the most status in New England towns like Longmeadow. Per church records, Peter was, quote, dismissed to Westfield 10 years after he was baptized. Cooley's wife was from Westfield, and her father was a known enslaver there. It is likely that Peter continued his life in bondage in Westfield. Peter, today in front of this congregation, we say your name, we see you, and we honor you. Caesar was an enslaved person baptized into this church in June 1741 and identified as, quote, a Negro servant to Captain George Colton. Caesar appears to have been in town for at least 35 years and is an example of a person we were able to trace in multiple places: William's diary, church records, town tax documents, and a merchant's ledger book. Reverend Williams recorded his baptism with a prayer with no hint of irony, quote, Lord, let them be thy free men, and graciously preserve and direct them. Town tax records in 1751 indicate that, along with livestock, Captain Colton paid taxes on Caesar. 5 years later, Captain Colton drafted his last will and testament, bequeathing Caesar to his widow and his eldest son, Timothy. Timothy profited off Caesar's labor in many ways, including financially, when he hired him out to merchant Samuel Colton for a period of months from 1769 to 1770, approximately 30 years after first appearing in church records. In February 1775, just 2 months before the first battle of the American Revolution in Lexington and Concord, Reverend Williams set pen to paper in his diary and wrote of his concerns over Caesar. Quote, I stayed the church and proposed to them whether it was not our duty to do something with Caesar Negro that had been kept from the sacrament of a long time, Some proposed to have a church meeting called to consider of various difficulties among us and press the matter. Told the church I was willing to call a church meeting. It is not clear what kept Caesar from communion then, or if he was welcomed back. Caesar, today in front of this congregation, we say your name, we see you, and we honor you. The third Peter you will hear about today is actually the first Peter we discovered in the story of slavery in Longmeadow. This Peter became Phyllis's husband despite many obstacles in their path, including community objections. He was baptized in the First Church on July 13, 1735. Along with Caesar, Peter was owned by Captain George Colton. Unlike Caesar, we have more glimpses into Peter's circumstances, likely because his connection with Phyllis. Of those references, two important ones indicate that he likely had been sent to support the household of Captain Colton's daughter when she married Sergeant David Burt in town. Sergeant Burt, who knocks on the door of the Williams household twice over 25 years to share the news that Peter is ill. The Burts knew that this information would matter to Phyllis, or perhaps they were looking for the minister to pray over Peter, lest his illness be his last. In 1751, Williams wrote, quote, "I went over, the poor creature is in a poor case." 10 years later, Williams refers to him as, quote, "poor old Peter," quote, "who got lost on his way over to the household on the dark and rainy night in late October. He had, quote, lay out in the rain and is poorly this morning," end quote. Along with Caesar, Captain Colton bequeathed this Peter to his wife and son Timothy upon his death. Peter outlived Captain Colton by 14 years. He died on September 9, 1774, less than 4 months after Phyllis died at the Williams parsonage. On the occasion of Peter's passing, Reverend Williams wrote, quote, "This morning, Sergeant David Burt came in, told me Peter Negro died last night very suddenly, almost alone," end quote. Peter's death, like nearly all known deaths of the enslaved, is not reported in church records. Peter, Phyllis's husband, today in front of this congregation, we say your name, we see you, and we honor you. The final enslaved person you will hear about today is Zickery. Tracing Zickery through Longmeadow and perhaps beyond has been a journey through varied spellings and plain old misspellings, various wills, probates, and online genealogical and newspaper databases. Within a 10-year period, Zickery would pass from Nathaniel Bliss to Joshua Field, from Joshua Field to his brother Thomas Field, and then from Thomas Field to his son Moses Field, all of Longmeadow. Zickery first appeared before us in 1737 in Nathaniel Bliss's last will and testament, where Bliss states, quote, "I give and bequeath also to my beloved cousin Joshua Field my Negro boy Zickeries, as also my cart plows, harrows, chains, axes, hoes, scythe, sickles, yea, all my husbandry tools or implements, whatsoever to him and his heirs forever," end quote. When Bliss died, his probate valued, quote, "one Negro called Zickery, 110 pounds, unquote. Zickery was admitted to the First Church of Christ membership on the same day as Caesar. It would appear that Zick took his faith seriously because he appeared at Reverend Williams' door one July morning soon after his baptism. Williams wrote, quote, "Poor Zick comes to me this morning giving me an account of his distress. The word touched him yesterday," end quote. The last record of Zickery in Longmeadow is in 1747. However, a curious lead has popped up in Simsbury, Connecticut, 13 years later in yet another man's will. Joseph Phelps of Simsbury states in his will, quote, "I do order that my Negro man servant Zickery and my Negro woman servant Kitty, that our husband and wife shall not after my decease be parted asunder, but have liberty to choose their master and mistress among my children to live with," end quote. Though we have found no link between Phelps and Moses Field, it is possible that this is the same Zickery. And if it is indeed the same Zickery, it is likely that this man had enlisted in a Connecticut battalion to fight for 3 years in the American Revolution. The math would make sense if Zickery truly was a boy in 1737 when Nathaniel Bliss first mentioned him in his will. More work needs to be done to look into this connection, but if true, it is exciting to think that in his 50s, Zickery could have fought for such an important cause. Zickery, today in front of this congregation, we say your name, we see you, and we honor you.
Invite you to, as part of our benediction, let's spend a few moments of quiet, of silence, holding these names and these human beings up to the light. In this powerful silence, we are reminded that we are all one. The Judeo-Christian scriptures in the book of Genesis claim that all human beings bear the image of God. We can understand that to mean that all human beings share certain elements of their Creator, of our Creator. That of the ability to show compassion, to offer and accept forgiveness, to be brave, and also a certain moral sense to know what is right and what is wrong. These scriptures claim this is for all people in the world, past, present, and future. And so on this day, as we hold up these names of these 16 enslaved peoples, representing many, many enslaved peoples throughout the Massachusetts colony, New England, the United States, and all of the world, remembering that to this very day, people, human beings that bear your image are held in enslavement by other human beings who also bear your image. And so we pray, Holy One, not only for ourselves, but for all people, that we would claim that courage in which you gave us to be willing to see your image in other people, regardless of their race, their gender, to whom they are attracted, their sexual identity, all of that. All of these you are created by you. And so, gracious God, we know better, and so help us to do better. We thank you for gathering us here today. We thank you for this ritual and for this space to do it in. And as we go now, may we go with heavy hearts, and yet also with repentant hearts, and also with inspired hearts, to know that you claim us and want to use us for vehicles of your good in this world for every day that is to come. In your many names, amen.